And good evening again, everybody, and welcome to the place we like to call our home away from home at TVO, the Munk School of Global Affairs, where on the last Thursday of every month we gather to have a discussion about some pressing issue on foreign affairs. Joining us tonight to consider Middle Eastern expectations, Thabit Abdullah, Professor of History at York University, Mazen Shwaib, Managing Director of CLIC, Canadian Leaders in International Consulting, Mohammed Fadl, Professor of Law here at the University of Toronto, Lucan Wei, Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto, and Janice Stein, TVO's Foreign Affairs Analyst and Director of this Munk School. A reminder, everybody, that you can have your say on this topic, and we do love to hear from you. Mike Miner is moderating a live online chat on our website. That's tvo.org/theagenda. Click on the Inside Agenda blog, and you can weigh in with your thoughts tonight. Or you can send us a tweet via Twitter. That's twitter.com. Use the hashtag YourAgenda. Or you can pick us up on Facebook. Our Facebook page is facebook.com/theagenda. And a reminder, as we have become a tradition of doing here, every night at 9 o'clock Eastern Time, we go off the air here at the Munk School on television, but we're online on our webpage, tvo.org/theagenda, at which point our guests will take your comments and questions directly to them. So dial us up, and if you want, you can start to weigh in on that right now. Okay, everybody, welcome. You have all been on our program before and have weighed in with your thoughts on the really quite astonishing events that have taken place in the Middle East over the past couple of months. Thinking back to a month ago, I want to know what has startled each of you the most in the interceding month. Mohammed, get us started. What's the most startling thing that's taken place over the past month, comparing today to where we were a month ago?
I think the fact that the revolutionary spirit is spreading, gone from Tunisia to Egypt to Yemen to Bahrain to Syria and to Oman. Very little reporting, but there's also civil disturbances in Oman, which is probably the best governed of the 6 GCC countries. And then I think yesterday the Kuwaiti cabinet resigned. So I think the spread, the rapid spread of discontent in public, the Arab public willingness to express their opposition to their governments has really been quite astonishing.
Thabit, what would you say?
From the beginning, I was quite interested in the pan-Arab phenomena here, that this has re-established pan-Arabism, though from a grassroots up. And for me, the most astonishing thing are the developments in Syria, a regime that was probably, if Oman was the best governed, perhaps Syria of all the Arab regimes after the fall of Saddam Hussein is the best controlled. And yet it cannot remain immune from this.
Okay, we're going to work our way towards the middle. Mazen, you're next.
The biggest surprise for me is the reawakening of the Arab street, similar to what Thabit was saying, but the ability of the people, the demonstrators, to sustain themselves this long. I look at Yemen, they've been on it, it's been going on for about a month or if not more. In Egypt, there are still demonstrations taking place. In Bahrain, so it's sustaining itself, and the fact that people are seeing this as live or die kind of situation, that they have to continue, otherwise the forces of these governments, dictatorships, is stronger, and they can undermine what gains they have made so far.
Lucan.
So I guess I'm the resident pessimist here, but what's most striking to me is that the stakes of the game have changed radically since Egypt and Tunisia. In Egypt and Tunisia, the issue was democracy or authoritarianism. But as we move to Libya and Yemen, it's really about stateness itself. In other words, the protests have facilitated a breakdown in social order, which I think presents all sorts of new and very vexing challenges.
Janice, you're batting cleanup.
I was really astonished that Gaddafi was willing to use force in the way that he did. So in that sense, I agree with Lucan. And doubly astonished that he allowed his own rhetoric to escalate to the point where he actually provoked exactly what he did not want. So we've moved to fundamentally civil war in the Middle East at the same time as we see street protests, and that is the dark side.
Well, you've still got the floor. Let's follow up on Libya since you're taking us there right now. I think you predicted on our program a little while ago that Gaddafi's days were numbered, and he's still there. You surprised by that?
Yes. I radically underestimated his determination to keep himself in office and to use force against civilians in the way that he has done. And it's a very sobering picture because you have, in fact, an army in name only that fractured, so the state institutions really broke down. But the remnants that are well armed and well paid in the western part of the country against really a ragtag group of rebels who don't have the assets, and it's an uneven contest even after we've had international intervention of the kind we've
Luke and
had.
Sabbath.
Well, I think to understand what's going on in Libya, you have to understand what kind of regime Gaddafi's regime was. It's a classic, what political scientists call sultanistic regime, which are these highly, highly personalistic regimes in which there's no meritocratic bureaucracy, there's no autonomous military, and these regimes rely entirely on the support of family members and cronies. And typical for these kind of regimes is the fact that you have sons running the security services. This was true in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. This is true in a lot of regimes, in Yemen as well.
Syria.
Exactly. And the thing about these regimes is because there's no meritocratic bureaucracy, the state is liable to break down even in the face of fairly weak opposition as you had in Libya. But the other side is that if you have a son as your head of your security, they're likely to be the sort of a bitter ender. And as a result, regime change is likely to be a bloody affair.
Because who's not going to stick up for dad after all?
Exactly.
And their own survival is at
And their own
stake.
survival.
They will not live through it.
Sabbath.
Well, one of the lessons when we compare what has happened in Libya with what has happened in Tunisia and Egypt is that the areas that have witnessed the best results are societies and countries which already had a functioning civil society. Egypt was quite rich in its civil society institutions, and so was Tunisia. This is what facilitated the victory of the uprising. Libya, to a certain extent, like Syria, has almost no independent civil society. And that is why the struggle there is far more difficult and far more dangerous.
Mohammed, let me ask you to make some comparisons between Egypt and Libya. They're neighbors, but they've had completely opposite approaches to the way they have handled their civil unrest. Egypt's troops refused to fire on the people, and Mubarak is out. Did Gaddafi learn a lesson from that?
Well, I just don't know enough about the Gaddafi regime to be able to say he learned a lesson. I think maybe the nature of his army and its relationship to society was very different. In Egypt, the Egyptian army was the first national institution. In a sense, it produced the Egyptian state going back to the 19th century. There's been a tradition of universal conscription in Egypt for over 100 years. So it's very much a popular army in that respect, in the literal sense of a popular army. And I don't think that was the case at all in Libya. And a lot of people have made the argument that, in fact, Libya, or Gaddafi in particular, has actually hired a lot of mercenaries. I don't know to what extent that's actually true, but it seems to have some plausibility given the way that they're behaving as compared to other, like the Tunisian or the Egyptian militaries, which continue to be neutral. He had no problems getting his, or certain elements of his armed forces, to use lethal force on the population to an extreme extent. So perhaps it's true that they are, in a certain sense, not really part of the Libyan people.
Let me keep the focus on Libya for a second, Maz,
Sure.
and get you to give us your opinion on how effective the airstrikes have been so far in your view.
I think they've been effective to some extent, but the challenge is that they came in a bit late, and that gave to the Libyan regime, to Gaddafi and his sons, a time to regroup, to deploy their troops, to figure out ways in anticipation of these strikes. So that kind of affected the efficacy of this campaign. But one point on the difference between Egypt and Libya is that the fact that Egypt had institutions, no matter how weakened they were because of cronyism, but they still institutions existed, and the fact that Egypt is not a tribal society. There are small communities, small families, or what have you. But Libyan system is still based on the tribal allegiances and relationships. So what we're seeing right now, if Libya is fracturing along lines of the tribal affiliations and how much the tribes gained or lost from the regime. So it's not just, there's no civil society, as Thabit was saying, but the tribes exist, and they are a form of civil society. Now, how close are they to the regime? that's what we're seeing, the cleavages.
As you may have noticed, because you've got a monitor in front of you here, we're having tweets and emails come up throughout the course of the evening up on the screen, and we had a pretty good question just come up there. Should the USA be in Libya? Thabit, you want to weigh in on that?
You have to ask me first, don't you? With this question.
I didn't have to, but I wanted to.
Well, last month, I dared to oppose Janice on this point. I think she's proven me wrong, where she said that perhaps the West should go in with enforcing a no-fly zone, and I suggested that that would be extremely dangerous, and that it would be better if the Arab countries did this, especially if it was Egypt. Egypt has refused to do it, actually, has backed away from doing it. So where do we stand now? I think that the Americans going in and NATO going in is going to complicate matters. I don't think it's going to be with no strings attached. I think that it will leave its mark. I'm not exactly sure how. But there was a humanitarian disaster that could have happened had they not gone in. So I'm typical of a historian's response. I'm not giving you a straight answer on this. There is a positive and a negative side to this.
You don't have to give us a straight answer. It's obviously a complicated
It's a
situation
very complicated
and doesn't lend
issue,
itself to simple, straight answers. However, in its wisdom, the United States and some other countries as well, we're one of them, have decided to participate in this, Luca.
Right.
Was it a good idea?
I'm incredibly conflicted about this.
Yeah.
I think my heart is for it, but my head is kind of not quite against
True
it.
political scientists, aren't you?
Exactly. I think anybody who opposes the intervention has to recognize that we did avert a major massacre. At the same time, anytime you use large-scale violence, there are all sorts of unintended consequences, as we see in interventions in the Middle East throughout the last 30 years. And I think that we have to be cognizant of that. We don't know who the rebels are. Hillary Clinton, Robert Gates both said that we don't know who they are. And if this continues on for much longer, it's more likely that we're going to inadvertently kill large numbers of civilians, which could do the impossible, which would make Gaddafi a hero both within Libya and outside of Libya.
I wonder, Janice, also whether part of the West's discomfort in this, and for that matter, part of the discomfort in the region, is that it's better for everybody if they do it themselves, right? The Egyptians did it themselves. The Tunisians did it themselves. The Libyans are not doing it themselves.
Well, it's not only Libyans who are not doing it themselves. Syrians are not going to do it themselves either for the reasons that Thabit mentioned. And you can divide these governments by leaders and who are willing to use brutal force against their own people, and the Egypts, particularly Egypt, although Tunisia as well, where it's absolutely clear that no Egyptian chief of staff would fire. I mean, that was obvious from the beginning. So this argument that it's much better if people do it themselves, sure, if you don't have a repressive, brutal guy at the top. What's really troubling now as we look at this is it's not only airstrikes to take out the artillery that was being used against populations as the Libyan army advanced. But in fact, what you're seeing is this coalition is using close air support to make the rebels' job easier. Yeah. So we really have to be honest here. And not led by the United States, actually. It was President Sarkozy and Prime Minister Cameron who led this. We have intervened on one side. Now, because there's a ragtag group of rebels that are not organized, we now have intelligence agencies on the ground trying to do two things. One, figure out who's in this mix and who's not. And also, secondly, how do you get the arms through to these people so that they can do and some trainers through to these people so they can do a better job of resistance. This bears no resemblance to a no-fly zone, frankly.
Are you unhappy about the fact that Egypt has not participated?
I think like Thabit, in an ideal world, I think Egypt and Tunisia could have greatly assisted in a peaceful transition. Unfortunately, because they're going through their own very complicated transitions right now, they're just not in a position to do it. So yes, I think it is a little disappointing. On the other hand, I tend to be a little less pessimistic about the long-term impact on the U.S.-led intervention into Libya, because I think once Egypt and Tunisia complete successful transitions, I think Libya will be much more influenced by its immediate neighbors than the armed parties that intervened in its affairs.
Okay. Mazen, let me try this. We've heard some references to it tonight already. The fact that we don't know who the folks are that we're actually supporting in this thing. Should that hold us back from supporting them?
Not at all. I think what I may disagree with the hesitations. No, I agree with Janice, but I'm saying is this is probably one of the few times where the Americans and the West has come on the side of the people and not on the side of the regimes. This is one of the few times where there is a consensus in the Arab world that this guy has to go. This guy is unliked, and somebody who's crazy, seen by the Arabs as a whole. And for the first time, an intervention came on the side of people, we don't know who they are, but they are people of Libya. And this is playing a positive role in helping Libyans start a new phase in their lives.
You're not concerned about what comes next might actually be worse or less predictable or more dangerous or whatever?
No, I'm not concerned, because I think the immediate danger was, like Thabit said, is that there's a humanitarian crisis happening. I mean, here's the leader telling his people, wait for me, I'm coming to you tonight. And we understand in the Arabic context of this is that I'll take care of you all. Don't worry, I'm coming. If you want to pack it up and leave, leave. But what I have a problem with in this intervention is that while I was happy that it came under United Nations resolution, and we should keep that in mind, but I was unhappy with it coming outside of the responsibility to protect framework. That is something that I find is complicating things in the future for the kind of intervention we're engaged in right now. However, in terms of the public and the future, I think this is going to be seen as positive on the street level rather than negative.
But if it had been a responsibility to protect intervention, there's no way these forces could be doing what they're doing to assist the rebels, because that's got nothing to do with responsibility to protect. Responsibility to protect is you stop the brutal guy from killing civilians, and then you stop.
Okay.
We have not stopped.
This is where the people would be able to help themselves, right?
Well, no, but they can't, as you see, right?
Lucan
They
wants in
can't.
here.
Yeah, I think there's consensus that Gaddafi should go, but I don't think we have any idea whether the rebels themselves represent any kind of popular, will or anything. I mean, we don't know who they are. And I do think we have to be concerned. We should feel a little bit concerned flying blind as we are. I mean, there was a time in the 1980s when nothing seemed worse than Soviet control over Afghanistan, right? Well, gee whiz, Mujahideen sort of turned out not to be so great. And maybe it's I spent too much time in Russia, but things can always get worse.
There is no obvious government in waiting, though, is there, Janice?
No. Well, there is something called the Transitional National Council, and it's actually interesting because we talked about tribal leaders, and there is, tribes have a very important role in Libya, but that's not the whole story, because this is led in part by engineers, by doctors, by lawyers. So there is, in fact, a small educated class in Benghazi that has formed the opposition council, and they're busy trying to organize a government. But underneath it are defecting tribal leaders, and this struggle is ultimately about how many defectors can the international community force on those people surrounding Gaddafi. And there were two big ones today.
I was going to say, the foreign minister defected yesterday.
Kusa.
Is that a big deal?
Oh, it's a huge deal. He's been with Gaddafi from the word go. He's been extremely influential. And a second defection today, and this sent, in a sense, political shockwaves through Tripoli, because it really does say that the very stalwarts of the regime. That doesn't change the fact, though, that he has 3 sons, each of whom have their own brigades and will fight to the death.
Okay.
I thought there were 6.
3 sons with 3 brigades, so
okay.
with their
3
own
sons, 3
brigades.
brigades.
Yeah.
Let me just do a little business with the folks at home here. We'll take a little, take a sip of water, pause for a second, because we want to remind everybody we're here at our home away from home, the house that Stein built, as we like to call it, the Munk School for Global Affairs on the downtown campus of the University of Toronto. Last Thursday of every month, we're here during our season on the agenda to discuss a major issue of foreign affairs. Tonight, of course, we're asking about the great expectations in the Middle East apropos of the tumultuous events that have taken place over the last couple of months. Want to remind you that there are ways for you to participate in our program. Our fifth column blogger, Mike Miner, is currently online on our homepage, tvo.org/theagenda. He's moderating an online chat, so feel free to click on the Inside Agenda link, weigh in with your thoughts, and as you can tell if you've been with us so far this evening, we're putting some of those thoughts up on the screen throughout the course of the night. Immediately following the broadcast, we want to remind you at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, we're off television but online, so dial us up on your computer, tvo.org/theagenda, or on our Facebook page, facebook.com/theagenda at 9, what did I say, p.m.?
9, yeah,
Did
we
I
need
say
9
AM?
p.m.
p.m., nighttime, of course. We're not going to be on for the next 12 hours. Did I frighten you there? Okay. And weigh in with your comments as well, and we'll put those in our post-program web chat to our guests after 9 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. Okay, let's talk a little ebb and flow here. In January, it was the Ben Ali regime in Tunisia which fell. In February, Mubarak in Egypt left. A number of regimes are under siege right now, but none has fallen in more than 6 weeks. And I'm wondering, and Thabit, let's start with you on this one, is the spirit of revolution in the region starting to run up against the cold, hard reality of Middle Eastern autocracy?
Yeah, well, I don't think the spirit of revolution has died out. I think we're right in the middle of it. It's quite hot all over the Arab world in this sense. But there are massive structural issues that will not be able to, that no regime can change very rapidly. There is a huge gap between rich and poor. I mean, take Syria, for example. 30% of the population in Syria now live on, for basic necessities, live on about $50 a month. In the rest of the Arab world, the gap is even wider than that. Secondly, there's a huge problem with water resources. Again, all over the Arab world, in the coming decade, the average consumption of fresh water per capita in the Arab world will be about 10% that of the average consumption worldwide. So these are issues that cannot be resolved simply by a change from authoritarianism to democracy. Because of this, there will be real hesitation on the part of many of the actors. And we are seeing this, for example, now in Syria, where a lot of the people seem to echo a real concern that if, okay, we don't like the authoritarianism of the Assad regime, but overthrowing it could cause even worse problems because it will lead to chaos, it will lead to all kinds of instability, and we have all these other structural problems that we know democracy or some other type of regime cannot resolve very easily.
Mohammed, same question to you. Is the spirit of revolution dissipating in light of the cold, hard reality of Middle Eastern autocracies?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it's just a question of what kind of expectations we had. People speak of dominoes falling, and then they imagine that it really is dominoes falling, and if they don't fall successively one after another, then something's broken in the chain of causation. I think right now what's really critical and what will make or break the future of these revolutions, and if in fact it will turn into a wider Arab revolution, is how the transitions take place in Tunisia and Egypt, particularly Egypt. If you have a successful transition in Egypt, I think by dint of the sheer weight of Egypt and influence it has in the Arab world, you're going to see substantial change in the rest of the Arab states.
And so far, so good in Egypt?
I think as good as can be expected. Egypt was it's like a very large train moving very slowly, and you can't suddenly get it to reverse course 180 degrees or even 90 degrees. It's going to take time to get it back on track.
I think they've said, what, parliamentary elections by September, presidential elections by November?
Right. Yes.
Is that okay with you?
And I think it's, I'm trying to keep up with events very carefully, and so I would say things are going as well as can be expected given the complexity of the problems and the depth of the authoritarian structures that Thabit was saying.
Lucan, you wanted to say?
I just want to talk about the fate of revolutions, and I think there's been a lot of focus on the demand side, the discontent that stimulated the protests, and that's clearly important. But any political scientist will tell you that authoritarian regimes don't fall unless they're split within the regime itself, not just demand on the streets. And what you saw in Egypt and Tunisia, you had a relatively professionalized, autonomous military who was willing to break with the regime, right? The situation is much less clear in other countries. Look at, obviously, Libya, where he has his sons, who are presumably not likely to break with him. In Syria, you'll also have a sultanistic regime where the family members control parts of the security apparatus, but also where the security services are dominated by the Alawite Shiite minority who have everything to lose if the Sunni majority gains control. So I think these regimes are going to be much harder nuts to crack.
Janice, are there reasons why revolts in North Africa have had more success thus far than those on the Arabian Peninsula?
better institutionalized states, frankly. Certainly in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, not in Libya, which sometimes crosses over into that grouping. Much better, and Egypt, which has a deeply, deeply institutionalized state. These are countries where militaries are well established. They're reasonably professionally officered. Algeria went through a terrible period, a 10-year period of civil war just recently. But there are institutions. Compare Syria and Libya to this pattern, the picture's dramatically different. There you have leaders who have effectively stripped away all the institutions except those that support their rule. There are no functioning political parties at all. The military is officered by people who are loyal to the regimes and stand to lose everything if they break with the regime because they have very little autonomous connection. And I think what we're seeing, frankly, is the revolution come up against what I call the hard reality of deeply authoritarian states that have stripped out, insofar as they can, civil society. I mean, certainly Syria is a country with a magnificent history and a very rich society that has been brutalized by the regime that's been in power for 40 years.
Mazen, I should get you on this as well, whether you're
Sure.
feeling somewhat down about the fact that it seemed to be there was a real role going on, and now
No, not
it's
at
stopped
all.
for a bit.
Actually, I'm very positive, but I think there's a major factor that we're not paying attention to is that there are the more stable regimes in the region. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Kuwaitis, the other Gulf states, UAE, for example.
Don't
who are-
count your chickens before they hatch.
well, no, because these are very solid regimes. They may be undermined by certain factors, but they are putting tremendous pressure on the outside world. They're putting tremendous pressure on the Americans not to play the game they played in Egypt, and that is to give in to the demonstrations by the people. If the Americans stand up in Yemen tomorrow and say, we're on the side of the people, the regime will fall tomorrow. If they stand up and they say, we're on the side of somebody, because then it would give the people around the leaders the sense that, okay, this is lost, we have to get out.
Why don't they do that then?
Why don't the
Americans do that?
Well, there's a lot of pressure, like I'm saying, from Arab governments that don't want to see this happen, and they don't want to see the dominoes, start to fall.
The Americans had a 30-year relationship with Mubarak. Didn't stop them from
Yeah, but
saying
they still
it's
have
time to
a
go.
very strong relationship with the military establishment in Egypt that goes back as far as that, if not before Mubarak. So there are able to ensure that the military is under control, or the military has some sort of control on what's going on in Egypt. And if Mubarak fell, it's not the fall of Egypt as a whole. So we're seeing the same things happening in other countries. But where Saudi Arabia, for example, the other day we heard, or I read in a Kuwaiti newspaper, that Saudis are right now telling the Egyptian army, if you dare, or the Egyptian prosecutor general and the head of the army, if you dare and you prosecute Mubarak, we will pull all our finances out of Egypt. We will not support you. So they're playing that game because it's not in their interest to see the domino starting to fall.
You were shaking your head through most of that answer.
I have to disagree in the sense that this is a huge overestimation of the impact that the United States can have right now in the face of these kinds of popular protest movements. The United States and Britain and France sent the strongest possible signal they could in Libya, and the Gaddafi regime did not crumple, and there was no defection en masse. So I think it's a fundamental misreading. This is really a local story in each country, and it is when you come up against this hard shell of really, really ruthless regimes who are prepared to use secret police and military force and fire and kill their own people.
But the difference is that the Americans said the regime has to go.
Go ahead,
In
Mohammed.
Libya.
But it didn't work.
If I
Hang
could
on, Mohammed
interject
wants
here, I think the situation of every state and the geostrategic calculations for every state differ. And I think the role of the United States is important, shouldn't be discounted. And Bahrain is Exhibit A, right? I mean, the United States completely was happy with essentially a Saudi invasion of Bahrain, and the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said this was legitimate because the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, has a mutual defense agreement. But I wonder if the mutual defense agreement really covers, civil disturbances. But it was obvious that the United States has a different kind of strategic interest in Bahrain than it does in Egypt. Bahrain also being a tiny country of 1 million people, where presumably external intervention is a lot better chance of success than a country of 80 million people. So every country has a different weight sort of on the geostrategic scale. I do agree, I think the role of, with respect to the role of Saudi Arabia, I don't think Saudi Arabia is necessarily enthusiastic, to say the least, about these kinds of changes. And I would not doubt if Saudi Arabia is pushing back, using its financial weight to encourage sort of the counter-revolutionary elements in Egypt and Tunisia, et cetera, to slow things down, because they don't want to see a vibrant democracy in Egypt. I guarantee you that.
Okay, I want to go back a bit.
Who do you want to disagree with here? That's all.
I want to clarify something that my colleague mentioned.
Lucan?
Yes, about Syria, because there's a tendency to generalize a bit. It was said also of the Iraqi regime that this was a Sunni regime controlling Shias and Kurds, and the same thing is being said about Syria, that this is an Alawi regime. It's really not anymore. Yeah, I mean, this was the way that they first seized power. There's a very strong alliance between the Alawi elements within the regime and the Sunni merchant class, especially of the urban areas.
Just remind everybody, though, Alawites make up what percentage of the population?
About 10%.
10%.
10% of the Syrian population. They're primarily have rural background from the northwest of the country. They enrolled very heavily in the military during the 40s because this was one of the few opportunities open to them for upward mobility. And this gave them incredible power, with which then they seized the state.
So you don't see anything necessarily illegitimate about 10% of the population?
No, I'm not talking about legitimacy or not. Okay. I'm talking about just trying to understand the dynamics within the Middle East. In my opinion, the more profound issue here is a class issue. There has been, throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, a growing tendency toward liberalization of the economies, especially, say, for example, in Syria, if we come back to that. The privatization of the economies benefited greatly the merchant classes, but these became really cronies of the regime and created a very strong alliance with it on that level. This has caused a massive corruption, which has inflamed the situation in the country. The other point I want to make is not just about understanding the dynamics here and sort of warning against oversimplification, but the other thing is that even minor gains, say, okay, there's no uprising that has happened in Morocco, there's no uprising in Saudi Arabia, but the regimes have responded to this wave of demonstrations by reforms, which are toward, the reforms have generally tended to be pro-democratization, the institutionalization of more civil society organizations. These, in my opinion, will assist in future changes.
Okay, Lucan, let me pick this up with you, because I imagine the five of you who study this part of the world very carefully, and you've watched, obviously, what's taken place. At some point, you've probably asked yourself, okay, who's next? Which country do you think is next?
Well, I think clearly Yemen. I mean, Saleh, the president of Saleh of Yemen, has already lost, suffered tremendous defections. I think something like 17 or 20 ambassadors to different countries. A major general who was his ally from his own village. And apparently Saudi Arabia, which appears, he actually wanted to be, he was a Bahrain wannabe, right? He wanted to have help from the Saudis, but apparently the Saudis have said no. And so I think he's clearly next, but I don't think it's going to be pretty. And I think that we're going to discover sort of, again, as Janice mentioned, the dark side of these transitions, that you may have increased civil war, and it may have nothing to do with democracy, but simply state breakdown.
Janice, who do you think's next?
I think it is Yemen. That is a regime that is frankly tottering. The president, as Lucan just said, is virtually seated. He made an offer to hand over power to a transitional government and to stay in office until elections were held, but essentially, very similar to Mubarak's lost offer in the last desperate days of that regime, and the opposition has turned it down. There are intensive political negotiations going on right now, so I think that is probably the next one, and I don't think that's going to be long. Gaddafi, it seems to me, is inconceivable. he will be able to survive this. But it's going to take, unfortunately, much longer, Steve, than I originally thought it was. I really did think there were constraints.
You thought it was days when we
I
spoke
thought,
about it in
I
the
thought
studio.
it was weeks because I did not
Weeks at
believe
the
that in
outset,
this
yeah.
day and age, with the kind of penetration of social media and electronic media and Al Jazeera, that it really would be possible for a government to use this kind of force against civilians.
Matthew?
This family values.
Any guess at which one's next?
I think Janice is right on Yemen, and Luke as well, probably. But the difference is that Ali Abdullah Saleh refused that offer.
Yes.
He made an offer to leave within weeks or days if they put in together and this is what I think the Saudis intervened and said, hold off, and we're not going to let this happen. I disagree on Yemen a bit because I've been working in Yemen for quite a while now. And every tribe,
Wait a sec. What do you do there?
I can't say it on TV. I'm just kidding. We work on democratic development in Yemen, and we're looking at issues of development needs for some of the really horrible areas of Yemen, like Shabwa, where there is an Al-Qaeda element in Shabwa and other places, and we're trying to. It's an American-funded initiative that we're working on that is to bring in some development aid, but institutional development to these areas, so the governance system for the local governments changes for the betterment of the population, but and some anti-corruption as well, because we solved the corruption problems in Yemen, by the way. But
Well, you guys are good.
Well, so good. But no, to go back to the point that every tribe in Yemen has relations in Saudi Arabia, and they're connected one way or another to the security apparatus in Yemen. They play everybody against everybody. This thing's not working well for me. Anyway.
Just push it a little closer to your cheek if that's possible.
There we go. All right. So this is happening in Yemen. Ali Abdullah Saleh was ready to cede power. Then something happened, and he said, "No, I'm not going to do it again."
Do you know what
And
happened?
I think it's Saudi intervention. They don't want to see Ali Abdullah Saleh leave. And when you're talking about defection from top general, if you read WikiLeaks on Yemen, he had given the American military the coordinates how to bomb this guy a few months ago. So it's not as simple. It's much more complex. And this is a regime that lives by creating divisions between the tribes so it can continue to rule. Okay. And I think the jig is up.
It's also a regime where there have been rebellions, flagrant rebellions, both in the very northern areas with the Houthis and in the southern areas. Yeah. So this is not a regime whose writ even extended throughout the country. There's a huge danger here, by the way, of breakdown danger, and civil war coming out of this.
Okay, we're in the home stretch here. Talbot, one last point?
If I may, yeah.
One last point.
Whereas, Yemen might be the first to fall, the country to watch, however, is Syria. I truly believe this is the most important right now that's emerging on the map. And even if the regime does not fall, it's going to emerge from this crisis greatly transformed. And this is going to be extremely significant.
How can you say that when you heard President Assad's speech yesterday in which he gave not an inch?
No, he's not going to give...
It is important to just highlight what Thabit is saying, is that all these regimes are falling now because they had promised a few years back that they're bringing about change and development, and they're bringing about political transformation.
And then didn't.
And they never did it.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And in Yemen, I'll give you an example. The fact that the demonstrations in Yemen right now are organized not by average people, but by political parties, legitimate political parties on the street. Because 2 years ago, he had an agreement with them that he would reform the political process.
Exactly.
They decided to postpone the elections so they can deal with the issue of economic instability in the country and then come with a reform package and then vote a new constitution. He was working on getting his son into power rather than worrying about the people. And same in Syria.
But apropos of what Janice said, what was there in President Assad's speech that you saw that gave you any indication that he was on the right track?
Assad's speech in and of itself is not the main pointer here. Tomorrow, there's supposed to be a new call for demonstrations, so we'll see. There's going to be quite a bit of jousting between the regime and the protesters. He's going to make speeches. He's going to try and counter this. He probably will refuse to give in at the beginning, but he's already announced, basically saying that, well, we're going to do away with the emergency law. We're going to implement the new law permitting political parties and allowing those to emerge. even if he's not willing to give in as much now, over time,
He will.
I think the regime will begin to crack. And
Let's
there
get
will
a
be
question from the
changes.
back of the hall here, if we can. Go ahead.
My name is Vlad Bune. I'm a writer in Toronto. A question for all panelists. In any of these countries, is shock therapy possible in terms of creation of social reform in a democratic way or consolidating a middle class as it was attempted to some success in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Iron Curtain?
You're talking about a kind of a Baltzerovich effect in the Middle East. Okay, who wants on that one? Anybody? Okay, Thabit?
Well, I think if there's one place where shock therapy has been attempted, it's in Iraq after the American invasion with disastrous results. I think for any kind of reform, there needs to be some existing institutions which you can use to enact these reforms. Shock reform will require at least some institutions, and in the Middle East these are not that strong, with the exception of perhaps Egypt. So in Iraq, when this was attempted, it led to a plethora of problems and disasters, and that's why the existing government has gone back on many of these reforms and is almost trying to start from scratch.
Janice?
You know, shock therapy, as we, and Lucan knows a great deal about this, but shock therapy, as we traditionally understand it, would be catastrophic. And it's not even shock therapy coming from the outside. If any of these successor governments try even a version of shock therapy, what that would mean would be dismantling the subsidies and the supports that many of these governments have put in place on basic things like cooking oil, to support very, very poor populations. The nightmare shock therapy would be the kind of 1980s IMF consensus about how to rebuild an economic regime and open up markets. The biggest issue that I believe the successor government in Egypt faces after the elections next, so there's a honeymoon period now, but the biggest issue that government will face is how does it create the jobs for the 50% of the 40% of the Egyptian population, which is a fifth of those 80 million, are young people under 25 who have no jobs.
And no one's got an answer for that.
No
yet.
one has an answer for that, and that
Mohammed
is,
wants it.
I
Well, I was
mean,
gonna say
how do you
that-
manage those expectations?
Egypt has been sort of a faithful student of the IMF privatization program for the last 20 years. It's really exacerbated inequality and hasn't led to any kind of, I think, structural growth that would solve the kinds of problems that Janice was saying. So if anything, I think what Egypt needs and what I've been trying to argue for is some kind of social democratic turn, and where there's a real commitment to promoting economic growth, but at the same time redistributing those gains so that everybody in society enjoys it. For the last 20 years, the upper quintile of the Egyptian population has grown quite wealthy as a result of these reforms, while almost 50% of the population has remained stuck at $2 a day or less. And so that's really got to change.
Lucan, let me try this with you. We remember well, back in 2008, Barack Obama coming into office, hope and change, and as Hillary Clinton said, you know, the sky's opening up and angels are going to come and, you know, bless us all. And I guess in the 6 months or a year after Obama's election, there was what you might want to call Obama letdown syndrome, right? People were, when the reality of governing in prose ran up against the promise of campaigning in poetry, it didn't quite, well, many people were disillusioned. I'm wondering if you're seeing any signs of that happening in places like Tunisia or Egypt, where the great expectations were all over the place a few months ago.
I think that's a huge danger, and I think it's really important because people have incredibly short memories. I mean, the Eastern Europe shows us that you know, if the transition occurs with lots of chaos and they don't solve the economic problems, people are going to start looking back with unwarranted nostalgia towards the Mubarak era. In other words, if I were Gamal Mubarak, I wouldn't give up hope.
This is the sun.
Yeah, the sun. In other words, just wait. And I mean, we've seen it in Eastern Europe where the communists came back to power in the 1990s, which you would have never imagined during the heady days of
You are a
anti-communism.
deeply pessimistic person.
I
aren't
am.
you?
I
Yes,
am.
I
And
can
that's
tell.
my role here.
I'm glad Janice is sitting between us.
There's a dark side to my call here. I don't agree with you there. You know, it's really interesting, and Mohammed, I don't know whether you agree with me or not. Gamal Mubarak was the ultimate offense to Egyptians. because there was actually a sense of humiliation. So their government, their state, which they regarded as a national project, had become the private preserve of a family. It was almost a sense of embarrassment when you talk to Egyptians. So he was illegitimate because it was that father-son transition, which they had seen in Syria, and Egyptians know that they are more sophisticated, more worldly, more cultured than the Syrians who would engage in this kind of behavior. So the whole notion of a restoration of the kind that happened in Eastern Europe, it's not going to happen.
You may be right about Gamal, but the point is more broader that the old regime, which now seems incredibly unpopular, is going to look very different after 5 years of economic crisis and lawlessness. I mean, which is not totally unbelievable than it does now, and I think that's important to keep in mind. I mean, look, in the 1990s in Russia, you had lawlessness and economic crisis, which made people associate democracy and chaos. I mean, I think that's a real danger.
But there's a big difference here, is that the fact that the economy is in such shambles. Well, I disagree a little bit with Mohammed on the issue of IMF, blaming the IMF and the international community, because the fact is that this regime and the governance structures of these governments is geared towards nepotism, and it's geared towards corruption, and it's geared towards.
That's going to go away now?
No, I'm not saying it's going to go away, but I'm hoping it will go away. I can't promise you that. But what I'm saying is the difference is that these regimes have created this culture, and now the people have seen it, have seen the excesses, have seen the houses, have seen the cars, and they've seen that their situation gotten worse.
So there's no going
over
back,
time.
you think?
No going back. And I think what we're seeing right now, going back to the question, is that this is shock therapy, is what we're seeing right now. The Arab regimes have felt that they didn't realize the gap between them and the people.
Let me
they
get
didn't realize
Mohammed
how big it was,
on
the gap
the Egyptian
between them.
story so far, on whether the reality of where they are right now is taking away from where they were.
Well, I think you're in a post-revolutionary down phase just because people now understand that we have to govern, right? And even though they might blame Mubarak and the NDP for all those problems, nevertheless they've inherited them. They have to clean it up, right? You might inherit a house that's falling apart, and you might want to blame your parents for not taking care of it, but you've still got to take care of it and fix it, or else it's going to fall on you. So I think people are realizing that now, and they're focusing, I think quite rightly, on the kinds of problems that exist. I don't think there's excessive irrational exuberance that these problems are going to be solved overnight. So I do have some optimism because I think there is a sense of hope tempered with realism. And I think that will translate into effective policies so that in 5 years, I don't think Egypt will have anything comparable to what happened in Russia in the post-Soviet phase.
I like the Chairman Greenspan quote. That was good. The irrational exuberance. Good. Thabit, go ahead.
I just want to echo what Mohammed mentioned about the absolute necessity of addressing the economic inequalities through socialistic measures. I mean, I know this term is becoming sort of out of fashion now, but the gap, the class divide in the Arab world is the main danger now in the post-revolutionary phase. We are seeing some real danger signs in Egypt. For example, everybody was talking about the Muslim Brotherhood and the fear of that. Rather, there was an insidious growth of another movement, which is even critical of the Muslim Brotherhood. And this is the Salafiyya movement, which is completely decentralized. It basically has followers of individuals rather than a well-organized political party, but mass popular appeal. And the thing that they really harp on is the question of social inequalities. And their program is a semi-fascistic program. I mean, they attack women's rights, they attack the rights of Christians, they openly condemn democracy as being un-Islamic. So their program is truly fascistic, and they are gaining enormous amount of following. So there is a need not only for democratization to come out of these revolutions, but also to address the inequalities through a redistribution of wealth.
The scale of the problem, the scope of the problem is just enormous. In order to create the kinds of employment opportunities for young Egyptians, and those were, that was the phalanx, frankly, in the square, you have to create jobs in Egypt in order to do that. It is not going to come through the strategy. Leave aside for a moment the question of equality. You have to create manufacturing jobs, because it's in manufacturing that you have the opportunity to create mass employment. It's not in the IT sector. And you have to do something about reforming agriculture. Otherwise, what we're talking about, which is the most basic necessity, is not going to happen. If you look at the assets that Egypt has in place right now to do either of those two things, this is an overwhelming challenge over the next 3 or 4 years. And here's where I think Lucan is right. The clock, the political clock, is going to run faster than it is possible to meet the economic expectations of, frankly, 15 to 20 million young, unemployed people who have no jobs.
So he's right to be pessimistic about the future.
I think that is the biggest challenge, frankly.
Mohammed,
How
you
do
want to take
create
that
jobs?
Well, I agree. It's a really huge challenge, but I'm a lot more optimistic today than 6 months ago. I mean, 6 months ago the challenges were just as grave, but there wasn't a leadership in place that could possibly address it. Now I think there will be a leadership that can address it, and
The
so
expectations will be higher, though.
Yes. Yes.
I think the expectations are higher for the government to be responsive and do positive things. I don't think people will think that they're going to wave a magic wand and everything's going to be solved.
I just want to, I mean, political scientists have never been able to find any relationship between regime type and growth. Let me just put it out there. And so it's not obvious to me at all that democracy per se is going to make it easier to solve these problems. And so maybe.
I agree, but there's certain kinds of capitalist orders, like oligarchic capitalism, which prevails in the Arab
crony
world,
capitalism.
or crony capitalism. I mean, I think, for example, the Chinese model is very successful in generating growth, even though it's authoritarian, because the Communist Party is truly representative of Chinese society. Arab authoritarianism isn't, because it was centered on certain networks of cronies. Like, I think there's a study in Egypt that maybe 1,000 families in Egypt like monopolize 99% of the wealth, right? And so that kind of crony capitalism has to be broken for any kind of growth. I agree. Democracy, not necessarily, but democracy has a better chance of breaking that kind of.
Sorry, I got in your shot
politics.
there, Mohammed. Sorry, because we got 30 seconds left, and Thabit, go ahead. It's up to you.
Okay. I believe that there is a relationship between growth and the nature of the state in terms of the feeling of the population, in the way that it identifies with the state, in the sense that it can cooperate with the state. If a population accepts an authoritarian regime, this will facilitate growth. If, on the other hand, it doesn't, and is more accepting of a democratic regime, then that will facilitate growth. Right now, the mood in the Arab world is squarely against authoritarianism.
All I know is if we get this group together again in a month, I bet we're going to be talking about something entirely different. You know, this thing is just, this story is really moving. Okay.
Even more interesting next fall during the election period.
I'm out of time. She's giving me the hook. You talking our provincial election? Is that what you mean?
No,
it's something
the
else.
Egyptian election.
Thanks, everybody, for coming in from near and far tonight to help us with this topic. Our thanks to the audience as well that came out tonight. We're glad you could join us here at the Munk School.